Hey everybody, it's Rabbit, and today we're going to be talking about the entire Chinese helicopter tech tree. Well, I say entire, there's only like 6 vehicles in the tech tree and 1 premium, so it's not going to be too extensive, but it will give you a good idea of these Chinese helicopters. And I will be completely upfront, I wasn't expecting much when they first announced this, because a lot of the helicopter tech trees are just kind of copy-paste of American and Soviet helicopters. But it did kind of surprise me. These helicopters are pretty neat and pretty unique, so let's check them out. So one thing I do want to cover, because it's kind of universal to pretty much all the Chinese helicopters, is the unguided weapons. So for starters, you have the light rockets, and this is going to be one of your starter weapons on basically every helicopter. They're not super damaging, they don't have super high penetration, but you do get a decent number of them. They generally work, but they're nothing remarkable. The next type of rocket is kind of the heavy rockets. These have more explosive mass, but you carry significantly less of them. So they're more consistent if you can land good hits, but you don't get as many opportunities to land those good hits. The last option that we're going to look at are the gun pods, which is the 12.7 and 23 millimeters. The 23 millimeters have a lower velocity, fire slower, somewhat more damaging. Overall, the only real application for these gun pods is like taking on other helicopters. Against even some fairly light vehicles, their damage and penetration is just very inconsistent. So overall, the selection of unguided weapons for the Chinese helicopters is unremarkable at best. It's not anything to write home about. Additionally, all of the Chinese helicopters are new, or at least newer, so all of them have the custom loadout system, which is nice. So you can drag and drop options for the different hardpoints, always a nice feature to have. The other feature that is they've started backwards implementing these two older helicopter tech trees is starter missiles, especially on some of the higher BR helicopters. So you'll notice some of the higher BR helicopters have packs of 2 or 4 starter anti-tank missiles, which is pretty nice for spading the aircraft. And our first helicopter for the day, and your starter helicopter if you go into the Chinese helicopter tree, is the Z11WA. The Z11WA has pretty modest flight performance. It's not incredibly fast, it's not incredibly agile, especially compared to some of the actually pretty capable aircraft we get later in the tech tree. Its weapon options are a pretty unremarkable selection of unguided weapons, and its anti-tank missiles aren't anything to write home about. In fact, their 3-kilometer range is a little on the low side for an 8.7 helicopter. However, what it lacks in all those other areas, it more than makes up for by having the simple addition of thermal imaging. Thermal imaging is basically unheard of on a starter helicopter, and pretty much non-existent on 8.7 helicopters in general. This allows you to stretch the fairly modest range of your missiles pretty far, and even allows you to outplay gun-based AA pretty easily, to the point where I actually think this is kind of an auto pickup. If you're playing Chinese ground forces at around this battle rating, not only is this absolutely worth it, but it's a really good boon, especially because China currently has an absolute banger of an 8.7 lineup. So even though it feels kind of redundant to give a rating for a starter helicopter because you kind of need it anyway to start and progress the tech tree, I do think this is absolutely a top pickup. You should definitely get it even if you don't intend to progress further along the tech tree. For our next helicopter, we have the Gazelle. And the Gazelle is pretty easy to describe. It's very similar to a Z11WA in terms of armament. In fact, it has basically identical armament. It's also currently at the same battle rating, and it's in this weird little like offshoot of the tech tree where it's not actually part of the main progression. The Gazelle is reasonably fast and agile, especially compared to the Z11WA, which can feel a little clunky at times. However, this is where it gets really awkward, because despite the Gazelle actually looking pretty cool and being fun to fly, it does have this major problem that it doesn't have thermal imaging, and most players will be picking up the Chinese helicopter tech tree, or any helicopter tech tree, as just a utilitarian piece of support for their ground forces. And in that regard, the flight performance characteristic isn't that big of a deal, but what is a big of a deal is the thermal imaging to help you land your missiles better. So, despite the fact that the helicopter is very functional, I'm gonna have to say, unfortunately, it's not worth it, and this kind of makes me a little sad because I do like the helicopter and I feel like it works, but it's just so redundant compared to the Z11WA right now. If the Gazelle was either lowered to 8.3 as its battle rating, or the Gazelle was your starter and you had to go off to the side to pick up the Z11WA, I think it would make a lot more sense. But as it stands right now, I can't recommend it even though it is pretty functional, and honestly, given how few of these I see in the Matchmaker, I think everybody else feels the same way. And next up we have the Z9W. The Z9s are probably some of my favorite airframes in terms of helicopters. They're light, they're agile, they're fast, they're just in general very fun to fly. The big addition in terms of the anti-tank missiles is we now get the tandem warhead attribute, so we can go through explosive reactive armor more effectively, but we still have the 3 kilometer range, and that's where the problem starts with the helicopter. 3 kilometers is fine at 8.7, and it's even better at 8.7 when you have thermals, but at 9.7, when you don't have thermals, it's incredibly short because basically every anti-air can shoot at and kill you at that point. 3 kilometers is really not that far if your opponent has proximity fuse shells or if your opponent has surface-to-air missiles like Stingers, and you don't have countermeasures either, so you don't have any way to stop a Stinger from killing you. Additionally, it doesn't have any other defensive systems either. You have a radar warning system, which is nice, but it doesn't really help you out all that much. And I think the anti-tank ability of this helicopter for its battle rating is incredibly weak, or at least it was in all my games. I frequently noticed that I would fire the missile and just be out of range. However, the Z9W does introduce us to the TY-90 for the first time. The TY-90 is probably the single best air-to-air missile in the entire game. It's an infrared missile. It gets all aspects, so it can lock onto the enemy from the front, behind, whatever. It's very agile. It's very good at ignoring countermeasures. Generally speaking, it will hit far more often than it doesn't, and its range is a lot higher than it says on the stat card. The Z9W is an awkward aircraft because I can't 100% recommend it because it's so limited in the anti-tank role, but at 9.7 currently, it does have a lineup in the Chinese tech tree, and the air-to-air missiles are really good. So I guess I would say consider it. It's kind of on the knife's edge though. It could very easily be rendered redundant with another battle rating update, but it does currently have a home, but I probably wouldn't invest too much in it. Next up, we have the Z9WA, and for all of the similarities in appearance, this absolutely blows the Z9W out of the water in terms of capabilities. One of the most obvious differences you'll see right off the bat is that instead of having only 2 missiles per hard point, you actually have 4, so you have double the ammo capacity. Additionally, your missiles go up for the anti-tank side up to a whopping 4 kilometers, which still isn't huge, but is enough that it doesn't leave you as vulnerable. Additionally, you have thermal imaging now, which you didn't on the Z9W, and you have a laser warning, a radar warning, a missile warning, you have countermeasures, and you have an automatic system to deploy the countermeasures if it detects an incoming missile. And you still have the excellent TY-90s up, and you can carry a maximum of 8 of a single type of missile or 4 of each. This thing is just fantastic. Like, it's mind-blowingly good. It's one of my favorite helicopters in the entire game. And you might be expecting me to recommend it because it's on my favorite chassis. It has a good mix of weapon systems. It can engage basically all targets. It has all the subsystems it needs. But it's at 10.0 right now. And as of time of recording, China has no 10.0 vehicles in the entire ground tree. So it's in this awkward position where it's an excellent helicopter on its own, but it currently doesn't have a home. You can technically play the 9.7 Chinese ground lineup in the 10.0 matches, and I found it worked perfectly fine. That's what I did for this video. But you're doing that exclusively for a helicopter. So I would say consider it. This helicopter is very, very close to being viable in general, and it's only really waiting for a small BR adjustment to give it a home and put it in a lineup. So I would heavily consider it, but it's not that great at this point. Next up, we have the Z19. The Z19 has a major improvement over the previous helicopters, all of them, in that it now has 4 hard points instead of only 2. Each of them carries up to 4 missiles, so it does have a much better ammo capacity than anything else we've had previously. The only other things it really adds over the Z9WA is you get a mass-mounted radar. Now, the mass-mounted radar is a little dodgy because in ground search mode, it tends to pick up friendlies and wrecks a little bit too much, so it's not that useful. In the air search mode, it does a fairly slow sweep, but it does sweep in a 360, so it can sometimes let you know when incoming planes or helicopters are coming after you. Not the best feature, but situationally useful. The other advantage you get over the Z9WA is the auto tracker system. You can use this with the sight stabilization button in-game to allow you to lock on to targets and even shift your aim within a target while it's moving, which is pretty nice. And you should probably understand how this works when you start using these highest-tier helicopters. As far as the weapons, you still have the excellent TY-90s, except the missiles, it's important to remember, the anti-tank, anti-aircraft missiles, basically everything but the rockets, are hard-locked to specific hard points. So even though we have TY-90s and anti-tank missiles, we can still only carry 8 of each. We can't just carry 16 of one type. As far as the anti-tank missiles, I would refer to them as sawed-off Hellfires. They have slightly shorter range than the American Hellfire, and they don't have as much penetration or explosive mass, so they tend to be a little less consistent in terms of damage. But overall, generally behave the same and can usually take out the same targets, other than the occasional inconsistency. So overall, the Z-19 is a fairly capable top-tier helicopter. You could just run it at top tier. It's currently at 10.7. China does have a 10.7 lineup that you could run with the two ZTZ-99 Block 2 and Block 3 tanks. And it does work in that lineup, but it would also work at an 11.3 without any real problems. The helicopter just has everything you need. I would say it's 100% worth it, and you could just stop here in the tech tree if you really wanted to. And next up, we'll briefly go into the premium Z-19E before we cover the last helicopter in the line, because obviously it's very similar to the previous helicopter. There are two notable differences. Number one, you don't have the mass-mounted radar, and number two, you have this actually pretty sweet navy blue color scheme along with some white detailing, which actually, in my opinion, looks very nice. That's really about it, though. And if you look at the anti-tank missiles, I believe they technically have different names in-game. However, in practice, they have nearly identical stats. They function nearly identically, so you're not really going to notice a difference. And the hard points basically carry the same weapons. You still have TY-90s, you still have all the other subsystems, all that jazz. The big thing about the Z-19E is that it's a premium, and the question of is it worth its price has to be asked. And it's hard for me to definitively say yes about that because it's important to remember Z-19E is mostly just a worse Z-19 at the same battle rating. So the real value of the Z-19E isn't necessarily in that it does something that something in the tech tree doesn't, it's simply that it gives you access to a higher tier helicopter that's maybe more efficient at researching. However, the helicopter tech trees in this game are kind of tedious to research and grind out upgrades for, especially at the higher tiers and especially as you start getting towards end of the line vehicles. So as a substitute for, say, the actual tech tree helicopters at this battle rating, and as a way to grind out some of those lower tier helicopters to fill out other lineups, I think it's excellent. But if you intend to go all the way through the entire tech tree, it's a lot more questionable because obviously once you get done with the entire tech tree, you're just going to have a better helicopter and there's no reason to use it again. So I would consider it, especially at half price. I think it's not bad by any means, it's very functional, but it kind of just depends on what you're up for. And last but not least, the end of the line for the Chinese tech tree, we have the Z10. The Z10 shares a few features in common with the Z19. The big trade-off is that it loses the mass-mounted radar, but instead gains a nose-mounted 23mm cannon. The 23mm cannon, however, isn't the most useful feature in the world. The biggest advantage it has is that in conjunction with the auto tracker, you can use it to engage aircraft, planes, helicopters, etc. much more efficiently than trying to fire missiles at them, especially at closer ranges. But against ground vehicles, the damage and penetration are just a little too weak to be consistently useful. The other kind of weird change is that most of the tech tree up to this point has been fairly light and even to an extent repurposed civilian helicopters. This is a dedicated gunship and she is quite heavy. And maneuvering helicopters around in the air, you have to fight the inertia whenever you're trying to stop or change directions, so she does have a lot more momentum than her predecessors. This doesn't necessarily mean she's not as fast or agile. I actually found she was faster than the Z19s, but you do have to keep this in mind when you're trying to get into positions because it will lead to some awkward scenarios of you running into trees. There are two changes to the weapon systems on this over the Z19 as well when you start talking the hardpoint weapons. First off, you can carry TY-90s on all 4 of its hardpoints for a total of 16 air-to-air missiles. This is currently the most missiles for the air-to-air role carried by any aircraft in the entire game, which is kind of cool, although a little excessive in most cases. The other change is the Hellfires, or the Hellfire-like missiles. They're not actually Hellfires. While the previous Z19 and Z19E had what I would refer to as sawed-off Hellfires because they were slightly worse, these are more like super Hellfires. They have the same range, but they have better penetration, and they do have more explosive mass. And anecdotally, this resulted in a lot more consistent kills, even with not as well-placed shots. Overall, the Z10 is one of those interesting cases where I do think it is the best helicopter in the tech tree for top tier, but it's not leagues better than the previous helicopter in the line, and it's an end-of-the-line helicopter which is really obnoxious to grind. So I would say you should consider it. I I definitely use it in my top tier lineup. I like it. I do prefer it to the Z19 for the battle ratings in which I can use it. But man, it is really tedious to try and grind out a top tier helicopter. Alright, and that concludes our video. Hope you liked it, hope you enjoyed it. If you did, leave a like, comment, and subscribe. And I hope you have fun with the Chinese helicopter tech tree. I really did. These are some of my favorite helicopters in the game. I find they're incredibly functional, and I think you should give them a shot, especially if you play Chinese ground forces. Have a great day, everybody!